Good evening, everyone. It's a great crowd tonight, and I just want to thank you so much for coming out. I am Brooke Clement. I'm the director here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, which is part of the National Archives and Records Administration. Thank you so much for your commitment to this library and museum. It means the world. And I also want to thank the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation for its continued support for our programs like this. We also had two additional terrific partners tonight helping us on this program, Armed Forces Thanksgiving and the Howenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley State University. Before we begin, can you please be sure that your cell phones are turned off or placed on silent? And while you do that, I want to make sure that you're aware of an upcoming program. On May 21st, we are going to have documentarian Naja Pham Lockwood here to screen her latest short film. It's called Unhealing Lands, Birds Perch. It's a powerful documentary uncovering the untold stories behind one of history's most iconic Pulitzer Prize-winning photos. We hope to see you there. And to learn more about all of our upcoming events and exhibits, you can visit our website at fordlibrarymuseum.gov. And now I'm going to turn it over to Joel Westfall, Deputy Director here at the Library and Museum, to introduce tonight's speaker.
How y'all doing tonight?
Good.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Great crowd. Well, this is our third time hosting tonight's speaker. This is actually his very first time visiting us here in Ann Arbor. We hosted Dr. Logevall in Grand Rapids in 2018 as part of a Vietnam lecture series we held there. I also had the pleasure of interviewing him during the pandemic in 2020 with the release of his book, JFK Coming of Age in the American Century, 1917 to 1956, which, by the way, we just recently learned is being turned into a Netflix series, very similar to The Crown.
Hey.
Dr. Fred Logevall is the Lawrence D. Belfer Professor of International Affairs at John F. Kennedy School of Government and a Professor of History at Harvard University, a specialist on U.S. foreign relations and history and modern intellectual studies as well. He was previously the Airbender Professor of History at Cornell University, where he also served as the Vice Provost and as the Director of the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies. Fred is also the author and editor of 10 books. His book, Embers of War, Fall of an Empire, and the Making of America's Vietnam, won the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for History, as well as the 2013 Francis Parkman Prize, as well as the 2013 American Library in Paris Book Award, as well as the 2013 Arthur Ross Book Awards from the Council on Foreign Relations. His other works include America's Cold War, Politics of Insecurity, and the college-level textbook of People and a Nation, A History of the United States. He is a native of Stockholm, Sweden. He holds a PhD in history from Yale University. He is the past president of the Society of Historians in American Foreign Relations. Logevall's essays and reviews have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Politico, the Daily Beast, Foreign Affairs, among many other publications. Fred has lectured widely around the world on topics relating to diplomatic history, contemporary U.S. and foreign policy, and he has won numerous honors for his work. When it came to choosing who we wanted here tonight to discuss the fall of Saigon with us here, inviting Fred was one of those quite literal no-brainers. We look forward to his insights on the war in Vietnam, led us down the dark path into the conflict, and finally how it all came to an end 50 years ago tomorrow. Tonight's program will begin with Dr. Logevall giving a brief lecture, and I will then join him on the stage to have a discussion about the 50th anniversary event, followed by your questions. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Fred Logevall.
What?
Well, thank you so much, Joel, for the kind introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming out on a beautiful evening, and I'm so honored to be here. As Joel mentioned, it's my third time with the library, and so thrilled to be here. 50 years now, as Joel pointed out, 50 years ago is when the world witnessed the so-called fall of Saigon. We could also say that it's 60 years ago that Vietnam became a large-scale war for the United States, 1965. 70 years ago, go back another decade, is when Dwight Eisenhower made a very fateful decision, 70-ish. You could say maybe 1954, but into 55. Fateful decision to build up and support an independent, non-communist South. And finally, if you go back 80 years to the end of the Second World War, spring of 1945, you have a hugely important moment, which I discuss in my book, Embers of War, in which France decides to reclaim Indochina, which it had lost to the Japanese in the war, and Ho Chi Minh and his revolutionaries determined to stop the French from coming back. So there are several anniversaries we could be speaking about tonight. I think it's a good time to take stock here together tonight. I'm going to focus in my brief remarks, 20 minutes or so, on the war as history. But I want to say something at the top about today, if I may. I want to suggest to all of you that the troubles, many of the troubles that plague us as a society today, alienation, resentment and cynicism, mistrust of government institutions, mistrust of one another, the kind of breakdown that we've seen in civil discourse, in civic institutions, they have complex causes. I don't want to suggest this evening that they all are a function or a result of the war in Vietnam, but I do think seeds were sown during the Vietnam War era that we are grappling with, or that are still with us, that these problems have roots in the Vietnam War era. I think Vietnam changed how Americans look at politics, made Americans more cynical. Why? I think because Americans learned that their leaders were not telling the truth in all instances about the war, about the progress on the ground, about the casualties, about their own private assessments, that is to say, the official assessments. Analysts, you may remember, would speak of Lyndon Johnson's credibility gap. That goes to this. You could argue, I think, that Americans went from naivete at the start of the war to cynicism by the end, that they were too trusting in their leaders at the beginning of the Vietnam War and too lacking in trust by the end. And I suggest to my students, and I'll say to you tonight, that with naivete you risk disillusionment, which I think is what happened to many of the Vietnam generation. But I also suggest to my students that cynicism is more corrosive. Cynicism is more corrosive because it alienates us from the government, which is today used often to signify a kind of bureaucratic quagmire. I also think that cynicism threatens democracy because it destroys the power of the people to believe in change, to work for it. So I tell my students, I get up on my soapbox at the end of the semester, and I say to them, be skeptical. Don't be cynical. Because cynicism is easy. Cynicism is lazy. Oh, all the politicians are corrupt. Is an easy statement to make, but I urge them to be skeptical. I mean, think about this. It seems to me that you don't create and complete the interstate highway system. You don't build huge numbers of public schools and universities. You don't enact the Great Society. You don't go to the moon. All of which America did in the 1960s. At the same time that it was fighting in Southeast Asia. You don't do all of those things if you're cynical about government and politics. As Joel mentioned, I'm now working on a Life and Times biography of John F. Kennedy. Kennedy didn't have that cynicism about government and what government could accomplish. He was not cynical about government and politicians. And he and others in the 60s, including Lyndon Johnson, accomplished these things that I just met. We can come back to this if anybody's interested, but I wanted to say that at the start, let me now do two things in my brief time this evening. The first is to talk about the three presidents who are at the heart of this story: Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. And then to say a little bit at the end about some takeaways, some lessons, if you will, that I've taken from about the war in Vietnam. I will not talk about, in the interest of time, but we can come back to it if anybody's interested, the early years, except to say that World War II is very important to everything that will happen later in Vietnam. And the French War, which lasts from late 1946 to 1954, the so-called First Vietnam War, is also important to explaining everything that happens in the Second Vietnam War, which is the American. I won't say more about them here. Let me say a few words about Kennedy to start. Vietnam is often called Johnson's War, and that's not altogether wrong. LBJ's decisions mattered greatly. I am among those who believes that the counterfact regarding what a surviving Kennedy would have done in Vietnam is an important counterfact. In other words, the transition between Kennedy and Johnson is important. And Johnson's decision-making was key. If I had to single out a single individual who mattered most in terms of American policy in Vietnam, I would choose Lyndon Johnson. So Kennedy's also important. So I want to just spend a few minutes on him because he's interesting. It turns out that John F. Kennedy understood the challenges involved in attempting to thwart revolutionary nationalists in Vietnam by military means. He understood the dynamics involved maybe more than any other senior U.S. official throughout the period of question, other than perhaps FDR. And I'm leaving FDR out of this because Roosevelt died in April of 1945. It had not yet become a large-scale conflict. He, too, had, I think, a pretty acute understanding of what would be involved in waging a military effort in this part of the world. Kennedy certainly also had that skepticism. Already in 1951, Kennedy visited Indochina with his brother Bobby and their sister Patricia. Kennedy at this point is a young congressman. He's 34 years old. He's thinking of running for the Senate. They visit Indochina during the French War. It's almost cinematic when I think about the three siblings in Vietnam during a time of error. And Kennedy, and we know this both from his letters home, from the diary he kept, from the speeches that he gave in Boston when he came back, we know that Kennedy saw through the French expressions of bravado and optimism. He asked penetrating questions about whether France, or by extension any Western power, could defeat Ho Chi Minh and his revolutionary forces. That's Kennedy in 1951. Those doubts that he formulated, that he developed in 51, I don't think they ever went away. In other words, when Kennedy became president a decade later in 1961, I think he still had misgivings about what Western military power could accomplish in that part. But here's the paradox. And in my biography that I'm writing, I'm trying to resolve this paradox, if that's what one does with paradoxes.
Abraham.
Paradox is this: that same John F. Kennedy, who had those doubts, deepened U.S. involvement considerably during his 1,000 days as president. Before he was assassinated in Dallas, he deepened U.S. involvement substantially. so that in 1962, vast quantities of the best American weapons, fighter aircraft, armed personnel carriers arrived in South Vietnam, along with thousands of additional military advisors, some of whom were taking part in combat. That's 62. That's under Kennedy. By the end of 1962, the number of U.S. military advisors numbered 11,000. And by the time of Kennedy's assassination, when he left on that fateful trip to Texas, there were 16,000 U.S. military advisors. In 1964, under President Johnson, the number went to 23,000. You can see where this is going.
Yeah.
Congress voted in August of 1964. I saw that there's a copy of this out there in the foyer out here, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, approved by Congress in 1964, giving Johnson essentially unlimited power to wage war as he saw fit in Southeast Asia. And I may come back, say a word or two about the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution later. Then finally, of course, in early 1965, Johnson decides to Americanize the war, to embark on a large-scale escalation in February and March of 1965, and to begin a sustained air war as well. That U.S. troop count would max out early in the Nixon administration at around 550,000. The figure would then begin to decline as Nixon adopted his Vietnamization policy, the reverse of Americanization, Vietnamization. But at the same time, Nixon continued the air war and indeed expanded the struggle, even as he embarked on this troop withdrawal through Vietnamization. Nixon intensified the bombing of North Vietnam and also enemy supply depots in neighboring Cambodia, hoping to pound Hanoi concessions. He also expanded the ground war into both Cambodia and Laos. And the Washington Post called Richard Nixon the greatest bomber in history. And the war continued for 4 years under Nixon, until in late January 1973, U.S. and North Vietnamese negotiators reached an agreement on a deal, the Paris Peace Accord. And you could say that now the U.S. war effectively came to an end in 1973. And then, 50 years ago, tomorrow, as Joel reminded us, North Vietnam conquered South Vietnam. Saigon fell April 30th, 1970. There's a troubling conclusion that I've reached about the three presidents, and I've only sketched out quickly, obviously, their tenures. But the troubling conclusion that I've reached on the basis of my research is that none of these three presidents really believed in the war during their administrations. Privately, underscore privately, the three presidents doubted the prospects. And in the case of Lyndon Johnson, who's ultimately the most important of the three, I believe, Johnson even doubted the prospects with the introduction of American ground troops, with the start of the air war. And maybe more troubling still is that these three presidents doubted that the outcome really mattered to U.S. security. You can be pessimistic about a war and still believe that you have to fight it. In this case, I think they even doubted that the outcome was essential to the nation's security. And I think the literature has underplayed this point, if I may suggest. It also, by the way, applies to key advisors. Robert McNamara, probably the most important of the advisors, both under Kennedy and Johnson. He was Secretary of Defense. McNamara, we now know, had early doubts about whether this thing so what we see, and we see this, for example, in the White House tapes, is we see growing pessimism. I don't see much hubris. That is to say, I don't see much exaggerated self-confidence about the prospects of the war. And in fact, in 1963, in Kennedy's final months, there's growing pessimism, again with the doors closed, about the prospect. Johnson in 64, even as he's planning to escalate the war, perhaps after his election in November, wonders about the ultimate importance of the struggle to U.S. national security. I was thinking tonight about playing a couple of tapes that give you a sense of this. I decided not to do so in the interest of time because Joel and I are going to get into a discussion pretty soon. But let me just give you two quotes. This is Kennedy in May of 1964 to his national security advisor in a recorded conversation on the telephone. May of 64. I don't think it's worth fighting for, and I don't think we can get out. Think about it. I don't think it's worth fighting for, and I don't think we can get out. An extraordinary assertion by an American president. In any war, at any time. Second quote, this is March of 65, just as he's escalating the war. Johnson says to Richard Russell, one of his mentors in the Senate, a man can fight if he sees daylight down the road somewhere, but there ain't no daylight in Vietnam. That's Johnson in 65. Now, he's careful to articulate these sentiments only privately and only to a select few. In public, he and his top advisors stuck close to the received wisdom, insisting that the outcome in Southeast Asia was critically important to American interests and that they were committed to defending their Saigon ally against aggression, quote, imposed from the outside, unquote. By the way, just parenthetic, these sentiments, sometimes the very language echoed that had been used, which had been used by the French, by French counterparts a decade or a decade and a half before. I also think it matters here that by articulating these things publicly in that kind of a way, U.S. leaders found, again like the French before them, that backing away would be extremely difficult because you've now painted yourself into a corner. And you know that hawks, both in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party, will stand to what may accuse you of going soft, of backing away from a commitment that becomes much harder to do. Advisors are also in a bind. They've asserted time and again that Vietnam matters, that is crucial to our security, and their careers and their reputations are now why. And I think, maybe to summarize this part of the talk, I think that what Kennedy and Johnson and their advisors found, and later Nixon found, and his advisors, was again what a long line of French officials had found, which is that in Vietnam, the path of least immediate resistance, which is the one that politicians generally, by the way, like to take, path of least immediate resistance, especially in domestic political terms, was to stand firm and hope. Hope is all it was. Somehow things would turn out fine, or at least they could hand off to their successor. I think that Kennedy and Johnson, as Democrats, felt the need to contend with the ghosts of Joe McCarthy, Wisconsin senator, all of you know about. They had to contend with the charge that if they didn't hold the line in South Vietnam, they would be called soft on communists. Soft on communists. What I'm suggesting is this. The three presidents most closely associated with the conflict in Vietnam, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon, escalated and perpetuated a war that they privately doubted was either winnable or necessary. So they sent 58,220 Americans to die for a cause that they didn't fully believe in. These numbers, ladies and gentlemen, these numbers matter. In addition to those 58,220, nearly 304,000 Americans were wounded in Vietnam, with 153,000 cases serious enough to require hospitalization. 75,000 veterans were left severely disabled. And we need as well to speak of the estimated 3 million Vietnamese deaths in total. 3 million, 2 million of them civilians, for the years when the Americans were heavily involved in the conflict. These numbers madden. They give a sense of the scope. Consider just the case of Laos. Consider just the case of Laos for a minute. From 1964 to 1973, the United States dropped 2 million tons of ordnance on Laos, the equivalent of one plane load every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 years. It made Laos, per capita, the most bombed country in human history. In 1969 alone, that is Nixon's first year, in 1969 alone, the United States dropped more bombs on Laos than it did on all of Japan during World War II. Nor did the end of the fighting in 1975, the anniversary we're marking at this event, the end of the fighting in 75 did not stop the killing, because over the next several decades, unexploded cluster bombs would kill 20,000 residents of Laos and maim additional thousands. The numbers matter. I'm not, by the way, suggesting that geopolitical considerations were entirely absent from U.S. policy. I haven't talked about it tonight, but the notion of falling dominoes, the notion that this is a part of a Cold War struggle against the Soviets, that matters, especially in the early years. Nor do I want to deny tonight that idealism, and we can talk about this if anybody's interested, I don't want to deny that idealism also belongs somewhere in the causal hierarchy. I do think that U.S. leaders thought that what they were doing was in the best interest of the Vietnamese. Ultimately, U.S. intervention would benefit the mass of the Vietnamese people. I think they believed that. Johnson believed that. I just don't think that if we are, as I tell my students, I don't want you just to give me X number of causes. I want you to rank. If we're ranking the causes, I don't think that either the idealism or the geopolitics is at the top of the hierarchy for these key months of decision. Finally, in my last couple of minutes, let me just give you some takeaways. One is that though we can talk of this being Johnson's war or Nixon's war or McNamara's war, we also need to put it in a wider context. Congress could have demanded a real debate about what to do with Vietnam. And lawmakers privately had these misgivings. The Gulf of Tonkin vote that I referred to earlier was almost unanimous. But in fact, if you look at what lawmakers were actually saying, they had real doubts about whether this should happen. But they were not willing to say so publicly. The press also failed to ask tough questions. And the American public, all of us, could have compelled a national debate through elected representatives. So that, what I call a permissive context, is also part of this story. The lessons that I would draw, just list them really quickly, and then we'll turn to discussion with Joel. The first is this, and I think this is also relevant to Afghanistan and Iraq and maybe future U.S. intervention. The first is that Vietnam shows me that the political utility of force is really quite narrow. Wars have to be won politically if there be one at all, at least most wars. Second, counterinsurgency is at best an expensive, time-consuming, chancy proposition, especially for a foreign power, because it's always hard for a local population to see an occupying force as its friend. Success is often temporary. Invariably, great violence will be used, even though at the heart of counterinsurgency is the notion of winning hearts and minds. It also involves, it seems to me, great violence. And finally, third and finally, exaggerating the stakes in a given war can come back to bite you, can reduce your maneuverability. It can put your own personal credibility at risk on the line. Having proclaimed time and again publicly that Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan is of vital interest, officials find it impossible to back away. Less for grand geopolitical reasons than for domestic, partisan, and careerist reasons, I would argue. Much more that we could say about this, but I know that Joel and I want to engage in a conversation about some of these issues and other issues, so we'll transition to that part of this, and I thank you for your attention.
Sorry.
So, Fred, you touched upon quite a few of the questions I had prepared for you for tonight. So, if you want to keep it brief, we can keep it brief. Your book, Embers, highlights how America got dragged into the conflict in Vietnam. Was there any way conflict could have been avoided apart from basically capitulating or allowing a complete communist takeover early on, which is, by the way, what eventually happened anyway, but as you said before, it took $3 million debt to get there? I do think there are moments, and what's key in answering a question like this, Joel, is what did people say at the time? It's very easy in hindsight for all of us to say, oh, well, this was a moment when they should have just gotten out. What I want to do when answering a question like this, and what I ask my students to do, is to go back and see, is it possible in the context of the time to think differently? One such moment, I'll just mention a couple. One such moment is right at the beginning, in 1945. We know that Franklin Roosevelt was opposed to a French return to Indochina. We also know that the French were very nervous about what the Americans are going to do if they try to come back. I think it's not hard to imagine one of two possibilities. One is that FDR survives. We sometimes forget that Franklin Roosevelt was 63 years old when he died. He's just a kid.
He did that sugar.
I mean, because he served almost 4 terms, or, we think of him as, oh, he must have been really old. I mention that because it's not that hard to imagine him, even with his health problems, surviving into, say, 1946, maybe 1947. And then I think it's very easy to imagine the French do not have American support, which they needed for this effort. So either he could have survived, or Truman could have decided, his advisor, that we're going to not, we're the most powerful state in the system, we're not going to be supportive of a French return. Then you have avoiding. Then I'll just mention one other thing. At the Geneva Conference in 1954, which marked the end of the French War, it was agreed that there would be election for reunification within 2 years. South Vietnam's leader, Ngo Dinh Diem, decided he didn't want those elections because he thought Ho Chi Minh would win. The U.S. supported him in that effort. I think at the time, certainly in hindsight, agreeing to those elections, even if Ho wins, would have been a real possibility. And I think Ho could have been kind of Asian Tito. He was not going to be, he was going to want independence from the Chinese. There are certainly moments, those are 2 of them, that we could talk about as being possibilities. Thank you. So you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I want you to expand on it basically from your research. Since you are an expert on both Vietnam as well as JFK, I have the following question, and that is, I had a grandmother who was, well, let us just say, a massive is not strong enough a word on how much of a fan of JFK she was. And she always said to me, and I love counterfactuals, and so do my students, by the way. She always said to me that if JFK had not been assassinated, there would have never been a war in Vietnam. Now, he, as you said, he surely escalated things in his administration. But did you learn anything in your JFK research for your books to think that he may have pulled the plug on the whole affair had he lived? I call this the mother of all counterfacts, the mother of all what-if questions. And I think it's especially conducive to careful analysis of this kind because Johnson keeps most of his advisors, so we don't have to introduce a lot of new variables. Also, we're talking about a relatively short period of time. JFK is killed in November 1963. The key decisions under Johnson, as would have been the case under a surviving Kennedy, come 15, 16 months later. What I have concluded, Joel, including in an essay that appears in the companion volume to Ken Burns and Lynn Novick, their documentary series on the war, what I've concluded in an essay in the companion volume is that though we can never know, the best answer for me is that a surviving Kennedy, he returns from Dallas alive. He does not Americanize the war. He was his skepticism went deeper than Johnson's. He would have made the decisions in his final term when he could no longer run for re-election. I think that matters. He used his advisory system than Johnson did, was more open to different opinions. For several reasons that I lay out in this essay, I think this transition matters, and Kennedy avoids a large-scale war.
Silly.
Interesting.
One of the most intriguing aspects of the end of Vietnam is what is called the descent interval, or the descent interval theory. What is your viewpoint on the descent interval? And also, could you please explain that theory to the audience before you begin answering the question?
So yes, the descent interval is a theory which holds that what U.S. officials decide privately that they'll agree to, and this is really Nixon and Kissinger, is a decent interval between the departure of American forces and the fall of Saigon, that which happened 50 years ago tomorrow. Decent interval, that's all we need. Now, does a decent interval mean a year? Does it mean 18 months? Does it mean 2 years? That, I think, U.S. officials disagreed on, but that's the theory. And the question then becomes, from a historian's perspective, do Nixon and Kissinger come to adopt the decent interval theory? And if so, when do they do it? And historians disagree about this. I'm among those who believes that basically they do, in so many words, that what they really want to do is make sure that there's a significant enough amount of time so that they're not harmed, American credibility is not harmed, they are not harmed, the Republican Party is not harmed, because, again, a sufficient amount of time has gone. And it's something they basically, and it seems to me, they adopt, and it comes to pass that they are able to get about 2 years between the Paris Peace Accords and the fall of Saigon.
So you had talked about 3 presidents. Let's talk about a 4th. Let's talk about President Ford.
Yeah.
Let's talk about President Ford's role during the days leading up to and including the fall of Saigon. Did he do everything he could to assist our allies in getting out? Did he fulfill what he stated was our profound moral obligation to our South Vietnamese allies?
Gerald Ford wanted to do more for South Vietnam in the final months, and Congress was unwilling to do as much.
Completely refused.
He could not get congressional leaders to support this. He had been, we should say just a little bit more about President Ford. He had been, when he was a congressman, pretty hawkish on the war. In other words, he had supported staunchly the defense of South Vietnam. He had been critical of Lyndon Johnson for not doing more. He had been critical of Johnson for not really having a clear strategy for victory. And he wanted, now after he becomes president, he wanted, as I said, to have more support for South Vietnam. He also said in a speech on April 23rd, so 50 years ago last week, that the Vietnam War was over for the United States, basically, in a speech at Tulane University.
So I don't think it would be fair to say that President Ford was eager for the reinsertion of American military power. He hoped to do more to help the South Vietnamese. The other thing we should say about President Ford, is that in terms of his policy with respect to refugees, he did quite a lot. This is now in the weeks and months after the fall of Saigon. So again, if we think it back 50 years, in the months to come, 50 years ago, he would be very involved, I think it's fair to say, in making it possible for refugees to leave Vietnam, many of them coming to the United States.
The Vietnam War and the fall of Saigon was recently put back into the memory bank with the fall of Kabul. Are there really any historical comparisons here with Saigon?
That's a good one. I think if you were to compare Saigon in, say, 1968 with Kabul in 2015, you'd see some similarities that I think are notable. And I may be painting with too broad a brush, but I'll do so. You will see corruption in high places in both the Saigon government and in the Kabul government. You'll see, I think, a reluctance among military forces in the two countries to engage the enemy. You will see the importance in both cases that sanctuaries played for enemy troops, where they could repair across the border and then be able to come back in again. That's a big problem for the United States in South Vietnam. Unlike in Korea, because of the geography, it's also a big problem in Afghanistan. And you're going to see, maybe the most fundamentally of all, I would say, Joel, is you're going to see the problem to which I alluded at the end. And that is that you're going to need to have broad popular backing if you are a government in Saigon and in Kabul. And in neither case did they get. And so those are important similarities. There's also an important difference, at least one that comes to mind, is that the religious dimension matters a lot in the Afghanistan case. This has been argued by several people, whereas, of course, in Vietnam, it's, if not a non-factor, it's not nearly as important.
My last question before we kick it to the audience here is, it's been 50 years. Tomorrow is 50 years. In your opinion, perceptions change, historical perceptions change. Has there been any change in the perception of how Americans view Vietnam, the Vietnam War, over the last 50 years? Has there been a switch, a recent looking back? I mean, what are they thinking? What did they think in 1980? What do they think in 1990? What do they think today?
Well, one way to answer that question is for me to think about how students have responded to this, Joel. I can address it also in a different way if you wish, but I'll just say a few words about students. I first taught a class on the war in Vietnam in, I think, 1995, 3 decades ago. Where did all the time go? I feel like I just started this whole thing. Some of you know what I mean. But I think in that first class, students were inquisitive. Students were very much, I think, inclined to be highly patriotic. There were more than a few veterans in the class. This was at UC Santa Barbara, where I was teaching at the time. Several veterans signed up for the class as mature students, and they were wonderful additions to the class. But I think, boy, this is worth a much longer conversation. I'll just say here that I think what I see in the early classes was the desire to believe that America went into Vietnam for all the right reasons, for noble reasons. It was, if not a noble cause, at least it was an understandable effort It could have gone differently. And over time, I think I've seen a change in that view, and an increase, I suppose, in the cynicism that I referred to earlier. Students are still hungry to learn. The students that I taught this class last semester, it's amazing. I've been teaching it off and on for 30 years. And the students were wonderful. They did all the reading. They came engaged to discuss. They were ready. I think they find it a little harder to understand how the war happened. They find it harder to understand why it is that American presidents decided they needed to do this. I think maybe they're a little less inclined to buy the defense, if I can put it that way, of Vietnam of Vietnam policy and of the Vietnam intervention than were my students in the mid-90s.
I think for me, the key goes back to kind of the winnable. I mean, when I was younger, I remember hearing from a lot of, friends and colleagues in the 1980s that, the war was potentially, they thought it was winnable. I've seen that change over the decades to the point where it was really never winnable, ever. And so on that one, I think that perception has changed a little bit, the winnability of the war.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there are still people who argue, still books being written, suggesting that it was winnable and that, in fact, maybe it was even close to being won when Congress pulled the plug on aid or the liberal press pulled the plug on aid. So you still encounter that argument, but you encounter it less. I think I'm just agreeing with you. You encounter it less than you did, and you encounter it less among students than we did.
Okay, so I have the first question here for Fred, all the way from Bismarck, North Dakota. And it does not have anything to do with the fall of Saigon. And I've asked Fred this question probably 3, 4, or 5 times over the last year and a half. And that is, what is the status of the second volume of your biography on John F. Kennedy? He immensely enjoyed volume 1 and is looking forward to volume 2.
I did not plant that question.
Look at that.
I don't know this North Dakota, this brilliant person from North Dakota. So I'm submitting next week as a vow to myself and to my wife, volume 2. So it goes to my editors next week. So that's the good news, I guess, as far as our friend from North Dakota is concerned. The maybe not equally good news is that it's now going to be 3 volumes. I think it might have been Robert Caro or somebody who said the following, it's a line that I love, so I'll use it. He said, "I'm working on the 3rd volume of a one volume biography of in his case Lyndon Johnson, and it's of course now going to be 5 volumes, but mine was going to be one volume, and then it became 2." And that 2nd volume, as I said, is done, and I'm submitting it next week. I'm very excited about it. Takes the story to the end of Inauguration Day, January 20th, 1961, snowy day in Washington. He gives the famous inaugural address, 1,367 words. What an address. What an address. Of course, the most famous line being, "Ask not what you can do for your country." I'm sorry, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. And that notion, I'm sorry, I shouldn't go off on a riff, but that notion of public service, the call to public service, on that snowy Washington day is the climax of the 2nd volume, and then the 3rd one will be obviously the presidency and Dallas, and the November 22nd, 1963.
Questions that
We have one hand. Hey, works.
You mentioned all the ordnance that was dropped on Laos. When I was there in 2013, we visited a center called the Cope Center, which was intended to help people who had been were still being injured and killed. Families still impacted by the ordnance. Children would go out and play and find it, and things would explode. But what we heard then, and let me find out if this is true, is that it was a policy for the U.S. military that the planes, the bombers, not return to the ships with ordnance. They had to dump it, whether there was a strategic reason for that or not, and Laos was the place where they dumped it. So, is that true?
I think it's basically true. I don't know if I'm not prepared. Maybe somebody else can answer the question of whether it was a strict order or a de facto. That is to say, do not come back with these bombs. Make sure you discharge them before you come. I think it was commonly known.
Yes.
It depends on where they flew off from. If they flew off the deck of an aircraft carrier, yes, they had orders to drop their ordnance so they would not land on the aircraft carrier with ordnance. They came from a military base, they probably returned with their bombs.
Sir. Yes, excellent presentation. Excellent. I have two questions. One of them is to the audience. I was just wondering, how many people in here actually served in Vietnam in a civilian or military capacity? If you'd raise your hand, I just want to see how many we had in here.
A goodly number.
Okay.
Goodly number.
And the question I have,
10 or 12.
it's always interested me, the deterioration of the civilian support to the war. The war in 64 was very different from the war in 72. So what broke the camel's back? What straw broke the camel's back in that thing? Was it not telling the truth? Was it the draft? Was it the casualties? Was it the music coming out of Hollywood? What?
Well, I'm going to answer that in a way that may surprise you. One lesson that is often taken from the war is that the American public will not long support a limited war. You see this all the time. I think that's not correct. I'm stunned by how patient the American people were. Year after bloody year, 65, 66, 67, 68. You could say that a majority, Richard Nixon certainly claimed that a majority backed his war policies even after he took office. So now we're talking 69, 70. That said, there's no doubt that support on some level slackens. I think what's important here is congressional opposition. Congress for many years have been quite content to leave this to the administration because it was a complicated issue. They were quite happy to relinquish their constitutional authority. Does that sound familiar? But then eventually, this is a very interesting process. More lawmakers, including Republicans, including Democrats, Johnson's own party and then Nixon's own party among Republicans, begin to raise large questions. I think that makes a difference. I think the anti-war movement on America's campuses and elsewhere also made a difference. Yes, it's true that the anti-war movement tended, I think, to romanticize the National Liberation Front. They tended to romanticize Poe. I think they tended to exaggerate, in my view, the economic imperatives behind U.S. policy. Nevertheless, I think the anti-war movement, and here I include not just on the campuses, but I also include among the clergy, in Congress, in the press, the media, I think they limited the options available to Johnson in his final, let's say, year, and they limited the options, the military options available to Richard Nixon. I think all of those things make a difference. And that, if I forget the expression you used, but in terms of breaking the camel's back, I think it's a combination of those things. And of course, once the draft ends, and once there's no longer the threat of the draft for young men in particular, that changes the dynamic. But by then, I think Nixon already felt that he had to figure out some way to bring the war some point to a close. But yeah, and we're waiting for the mic.
Well, here. Right over here. Right here. All right.
You talked to a point that Joel brought up about was the war winnable. In the early days of the war, or as the war came along, did anybody bring up MacArthur, who had a lot of experience obviously in Asia. He said, you never fight a land war in Asia. They will people you to death. Was that ever brought up?
Well, there were several people who I think, including in the military and also among civilian officials, who looked to, say, the Korean conflict and suggested that waging war in this part of the world, let's say Asia writ large, to go to your point, is just going to be a tall order for the United States. History shows this. And MacArthur himself, to my knowledge, was not central in these debates, internal debates about what should be done and what could be done. But certainly the Korean analogy is interesting. It's interesting in another way, if I might very quickly just mention this part. Early on, Korea was seen as a poor analogy from an American perspective. In other words, we don't want to see a repeat of Korea, in which, as you will know about the Korean War, it was basically status quo ante. What that is to say, when there was a truce in Korea in mid-1953, you basically reverted to what the situation had been more or less in June of 1950 when the war started. We don't want that. By the time you get into the late 60s, Korea is also all of a sudden looking like a pretty good analogy. Why don't we see if we can create the same kind of situation in Vietnam that we have in Korea, with a more or less permanent division, so it seems in Korea. It seemed at the time, and I guess you could say maybe still seems, a permanent division. That's something we could live with in Vietnam. So there's an interesting shift in how Korea is perceived.
Hi, thank you. My question is about Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
I was alive during that time, but I have to admit that I didn't have much good sense of what goes on in his head. Did he know the war was lost when he was running for office and when he beat Johnson? Did he plan for that, or was he gung-ho and trying to win it up until when? Did he change his mind and try to find a way out?
This is a great question, and this has engaged scholars for since he was in office, and it still engages scholars. And I think there's disagreement about this. What did Nixon believe when he ran in 68, as you said? What did he believe when he took office in January of 69? My sense, just to go to how I see this, I think he believed that some part of him at least, believed that he could succeed where Johnson had failed. That is to say, he could create conditions that would allow South Vietnam to survive indefinitely. Maybe a kind of Korea solution, as I just suggested. And then little by little, he's disabused of this notion. He thought maybe he could use the Chinese and the Soviets, put pressure on Hanoi. He thought that changing the bombing policy, expanding the struggle into Cambodia and Laos, these various efforts that he engaged in would allow him to win, even as he's withdrawing troops. Kissinger, where is he on all this? Somebody said to me the other day, 3-4 days ago, that Kissinger at my institution, Harvard, in 68 and 67 was really pessimistic. So at faculty, receptions and cocktail parties, according to this view, and these are people who were at Harvard at the time, so, I'll trust them. But Kissinger was saying, this thing, we can't win. And had he served a victorious Hubert Humphrey, according to this point of view, had he become national security under Humphrey, had Humphrey won, he would have been quite prepared to try to get the United States out. But my view is that Nixon believed for a time, maybe a year, maybe 9 months, that by adjusting the policies along the lines I suggested, he could actually put.
How did the Kennedy's experience of the Bay of Pigs inform his actions with Vietnam? Did it push him into action, or did he ignore his previous failures.
Yeah, Bay of Pigs is an interesting case. Obviously, it's going to be early in my third volume, so I'm thinking a lot about this right now. Did not plant this question, but it is on my mind. I think the Bay of Pigs ultimately was more of a restraint. I reserve, by the way, the right to change my mind on this when I write the thing, so don't hold me to this. My sense right now is that it restrained him more than it impelled him on South Vietnam. That he took from the Bay of Pigs the lesson that he was going to be much more careful about taking military advice from the Joint Chiefs, from the Pentagon in general. He was going to be much more careful about CIA, following what the CIA was telling him. A lot of people said to him prior to the Bay of Pigs invasion, which, as you know, happened 3 months into his term. A lot of people with seeming authority said, Mr. President, this thing is foolproof. It's going to succeed. It's going to overthrow Castro. Don't worry about it. We've got it all figured out. And he was skeptical, really skeptical, but he chose to believe them, or he chose at least to embark on this disastrous debacle, the Bay of Pigs. And I think he changed after that. That had important implications, by the way, for the Cuban Missile Crisis, subject for another session. But also, I believe that it made him more cautious about following military advice. He already, by the way, had come into office. This is a theme in the first volume of my Kennedy biography, that Kennedy, from his time in the South Pacific in 1943, tended to view skeptically what military power could accomplish. So he already had some of this. I think Bay of Pigs made him more so. He then has, I'll just mention briefly, a terrible Vienna summit conference with Khrushchev. And according to some reports, after Vienna, he felt like he needed to show U.S. strength somewhere. And allegedly, he said, maybe this is apocryphal, but he is alleged to have said in the weeks after Vienna, Vietnam looks to be the place. So if you take Bay of Pigs and Vienna together, maybe one causes him to, apply the brakes, and the other one causes him perhaps to go in further.
Oscar, I don't think you're giving the Korean War enough emphasis. McNamara in his book said every decision we made, basically there was an 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that was Red China. And in Korea, I had a quote from a Marine sergeant said, we killed 10 of them for every one of us that they killed, and they kicked our butts.
Yeah, I mean, I do think I certainly did not talk tonight about China. And let's remember that in 1949, the number of major communist adversaries of the United States doubled. 1 to 2. Which, you might say, well, okay, big deal. But you're talking here about the Soviet Union and China. Huge implications in terms of how American leaders, Truman in that case, but also Republicans in Congress and elsewhere, are viewing the stakes in this Cold War struggle. One of the things that happens, which goes to your question, is that the Indochina struggle, let's remember, this is when the French are fighting their Vietnam War, it becomes globalized. Because now you've got China right across the frontier of northern Vietnam. You've got China as a communist adversary. China can supply the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh's revolutionary forces, and they do. The Americans step up their aid of the French. So this conflict that had been largely a colonial war between France and the Viet Minh from 1946 to 49 now becomes, after Mao's victory, a much more important international conflict. Then, as you're saying, in June 1950, the Korean War begins. And you can see why this notion of falling dominoes, which we haven't really talked about tonight, for a time really animated debates in Washington, D.C., the halls of power, this notion that if one country falls, in other words, like in a row of dominoes, if one falls, all the other countries will fall. So I do think you're right to suggest that the Korean analogy and the fear of China, and maybe it's the Soviet Union and China together, is critical to understanding this, which is why, as I suggested probably all too briefly in my prepared remarks, that the geopolitical dimension here is not one that we should ignore, even though I emphasized other factors. The last thing I'll say about this is that I do think this lessens so that by the time you get into the mid-1960s, late 60s, that fear of dominoes falling, I think, has lessened appreciably. That concern about the spreading of Chinese power in Southeast Asia, I think, has lessened appreciably. But for a time, I think you're absolutely right. For a time, I think it's animating much of the discussion in Washington.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Fredrik Logevall. Thank you very much. We have some refreshments and some desserts outside of the auditorium for you. And again, thank you for coming. A great crowd tonight. Thank you for your patronage, and hope to see you in May. I had a chance to take a look at that documentary, which is about that famous photograph, the execution during the Tet Offensive. It's a 30-minute documentary. It's actually being put forward for the Academy of Motion Pictures for an award for Best Short Film. And I highly recommend you being here. It is an incredible short film. So we'll hope to see you in May for that. Keep an eye out. Okay? Thanks.